For the power of truth, this is the Glad Report.
To ensure we walk together in this discussion about the Zambian economy versus Kenneth Kaunda, I would like us to remember three things: character, Chile, and courage. Character, Chile, the country, and courage. Kenneth David Butchezia Kaunda was a son of two Christian parents, his father being a Church of Scotland missionary. He, espoused by the teachings of Gandhi, led a mainly peaceful struggle to bring peace not only his country, previously known as Northern Rhodesia, but to the region. He was a man with a mission to bring the people of Africa power, empowerment, and glory, a sense of self. Zambian humanism was what he tried to implement. He implemented egalitarianism measures because he wanted an egalitarianist, a somewhat socialist, though he didn't outwardly pronounce it to be socialist, was the type of economy that he had dreamt of. And because economics and politics are joined at the hip, joined at the navel, inextricably linked, the politics of the way he conducted the country seeped quite a lot into the economic scene of Zambia. Kenneth Kaunda, a Christian man, had good intentions. He had good intentions. What was bestowed upon him when he inherited Zambia on 24th October 1964 was truly a thriving economy in terms of the copper boom, as Zambia's government expenditure at the time, 1964 to the early 70s, depended on copper. 80% of its revenue, government expenditure, was coming from copper profits. Also, 20% of GDP was represented by the copper industry. The thing is, with the way Zambia was part of the Federation of Nyasaland and Rhodesia, it was never seen as the main part of that federation. It was simply seen as a subsidiary, feeding Nyasaland and Southern Rhodesia, having all of its profits, all of its makings from the copper industry siphoned out into either Southern Rhodesia, Bulawayo, or Salisbury, or Malawi. So its income pre-independence was siphoned out of its economy. So Zambia, in that sense, inherited very little. Its infrastructure was very, very little. If the infrastructure was not supporting the copper industry, it was deemed as unnecessary. In that sense, Zambia had a poor infrastructure development at independence time. Also, less than 1,000 secondary school graduates and less than 100 university school graduates. So obviously, even though he had a 9.5-month proceed already available in terms of income available at independence, he was tasked, even with a lot of fiscal space, he was tasked with having to implement a lot of infrastructural development, which he truly tried to do. It was heavy. Of course, with the ecstasy of independence, a lot of exciting infrastructure being built, putting a lot of money into the Zambian economy, building infrastructure for the hope that later social services will start to show way and people of Zambia will thrive economically with a thriving copper boom. The first shock that happened with the copper industry was in 1972 and about 1972 when copper prices dropped, but they quickly rebounded in the year 1973. Around that same time, 1974, Zambia decided to completely nationalize its economy. If you listen to the speeches from about 1968 to 1970, the speeches from Kenneth Kaunda, the Matero speech, the Mulungushi Stone speech, and the Mulungushi Hall speeches, he says as he acquires more property for the people of Zambia, for the government of Zambia to give to the people of Zambia in his quasi-socialist state, he says, this basically, and this is in the Mulungushi Hall speech, this basically completes our economic reforms. Now, Zambia is ours, and more wealth is ours too. With that speech and just that excerpt, you can clearly tell that Kaunda had good intentions. Good intentions. Good intentions. A Christian man espoused with the teachings of Gandhi. Good intentions. But the way things unfolded, a lot of unintended consequences seeped into the equation. First of all, with nationalization taking its course, that meant all the risk of the copper industry was put on the Zambian government. So anything that goes wrong with the copper industry, because Zambia is solely reliant on it with 80% of its expenditure, government expenditure coming from, government revenue coming from it, means that whenever anything goes wrong in the copper industry, things would go wrong in the Zambian economy. And truly, things started to unfold quite badly. In the year 1974, copper prices began to drop. And people were like, okay, so considering that in 1972 there was a copper drop, 1970 prices recovered, 1974 shouldn't be too bad. World Bank reported that the copper prices should rebound in about the year 1980. But the 1973 rebound in prices was truly mistaken for recovery because they thought it would recover as quickly, but it was simply a short rebound in prices. From about 1974 to about 2003, copper prices were at an all-time low. Zambia was in a fiscal crisis for 30 years. 30 years. Most of that during the incumbency of Kenneth Kaunda. Also around the same times, around the country, Zambia as its landlocked position, with Angola and Mozambique having the Portuguese leave and having the Eduardos having the civil wars in both Mozambique and Angola, meant transport routes to the Indian and Atlantic Oceans were cut out. And the closing of the Rhodesian border made things even more difficult in terms of opportunities for the Zambian economy. And with the heavy pumping of money into the infrastructure, into everything, meant Zambia was still spending a lot of money with the hopes that copper prices would rise eventually. But the spending culture that Zambia had developed was one that could only survive if the copper industry continued to thrive, or which it didn't. Nationalization in Zambia did not take a good course. If you compare it to the country of Chile, which also nationalized its copper industry around the same time, and which today is the world's largest copper producer, in the world, overtaking the USA and the Soviet Union, which at the time were the leaders. Chile looked at it as a business which needed to have money pumped into it for investment, where in Zambia a lot of the money went into pumping the money for really, dare I say, political developments, in the sense that much of the money that Zambia was spending, of course in infrastructure as well, was being spent on subsidizing a lot of commodity goods for the people, particularly those in the urban population. Urban population, these are politically sensitive areas in the sense that you subsidize things, sort of neglecting agricultural policies that could have been bettered and also diversifying where the government got its revenue from. But I also suppose that around the same time, because of Zambia having droughts, a lot of floods, maybe the government was disincentivized to put in as much money, perhaps. But the agricultural policies in Zambia were not as properly taken care of as they should have been. It was too much on a focus on copper. So when copper prices dropped, transport routes are cut out, there was a problem. If Zambia perhaps took a few lessons from Chile, it would have had a better course in history, because the same copper price drops that affected Zambia also affected Chile. But look at Chile now, it actually managed to handle its fiscal resources. Zambia had some artificial, I call it some sort of hallucination to think that there was still a copper price boom, in the sense that we'll still spend just as much as we used to in the late 1960s and early 1970s, which was wrong. Some sort of just artificial implementation of funds which really did not exist. Funds that were solely coming from the copper industry, which had its productivity levels going down. And with this happening, subsidies being pumped in, infrastructure mainly for the urban population, Zambia started to borrow heavily. Borrowing heavily, Zambia was now in debt. In the mid-1980s, Zambia, like it is today, went cap in hand to the IMF requesting for help. Requesting for help. The IMF said that if you do not put economic reforms in your country, we will not help you. What did these economic reforms mean? The economic reforms coming from both the IMF, World Bank, and the United States of America government. These reforms meant that you need to devalue your kwacha, and that's since put an auction for auctioneers to really place the price on the kwacha and not have it be fixed. Have it be a fixed currency, devaluing the kwacha. Also desubsidization, which meant you're taking subsidies, which essentially cushion urban populations from heavy prices, and also the prices that had come from all those cut-off transport links and all those difficulties in transportation from bringing things into the country. So all those subsidies taken out, currency devalued, copper industry no hope of recovering. Zambia was clearly in trouble, so the reforms were definitely necessary. So in 1984, the Zambian government signs an agreement with the IMF to devalue subsidies, taking out subsidies, no more cushioning for the urban population mainly. What did this mean? The initial shocks meant things like the staple food, which is corn, maize as we call it, had doubled in price, 50% increment initially, and then 120%, which in 1986 December triggered the people to riot in Lusaka and the Copper Belt provinces. Food riots that lasted for close to 3 days, with 26 amounting dead as reported. Of course, there could have been more. These riots had Kaunda go back on the reforms that he had put in. Reforms that, truly with his good intentions, meant better for the country. Better for the country. So 1987, in May, he goes back on the reforms, which means at this point the IMF pulled back and it said, no, this is now your problem. We told you what to do, and you're not taking our advice, because Kaunda had essentially, his hands were tied. In the end, Kaunda needed to exhibit courage, which he obviously did. In the final 15 years of Zambia, preceding 1991, Zambia had its GDP contracting by 2% per annum. What does GDP mean? GDP is essentially a measure, a snapshot of productivity for every given year. So productivity is going down. What does that mean? Productivity, meaning your goods and services, the companies providing those goods and services, be it individuals or conglomerates or just companies. It means they're contracting, everything is contracting. Things are just contracting meaning unemployment rising, real wages going down. People looking into Zambia, the outlook of the Zambian population and how Zambia is spending, purchasing power parity, they're like, oh my gosh, what you can buy with your kwacha keeps reducing. Just really doom and gloom. And with the highest debt levels per capita in the world, essentially, either by de facto or by de jure, Zambia was bankrupt. Kenneth Kaunda exhibited courage in the end, a mark of his character, a Christian man, stepping down peacefully, having Zambia once again enjoy peace that many other African countries, especially our neighbours, cannot boast of. Cannot boast of. And I think for that one point, he needs to be applauded as a hero of the Zambian people. We enjoy peace that not many countries can boast of. Zambia was in the hands of Chilova at the end of the 1991 period. The Zambian economy versus Kenneth Kaunda. My feelings are, some bring arguments and say if Kaunda had paid just as much attention to his country as he did in liberalizing all the neighboring countries of southern part of the continent, Zambia could have been better economically. I would suggest things went wrong. What Adam Smith might call the hand of God, I would suggestively call the hand of the West. Perhaps it played a role, and then also the oil crisis and how USA got involved with the Arab nations, put the entire world in trouble, Zambia included. The hand of the West, perhaps. My feeling is, if Kenneth Kaunda had known better, he would have done better. Kenneth Kaunda truly had the people of Zambia at his core, in his center. Really, we were the apple of his eye. We meant a lot to him. We were his people. One Zambia, one nation. His rule was a consistent balancing act, which meant in parliament there was consistent representation from all different tribes to prevent tribal conflict. And today the peace we enjoy, once again, he should be applauded, and instilling in us one Zambia, one nation. Because truly what differentiates us as a human race is that banding together principle that has us coming this far, has us being able to develop like this. If Kenneth Kaunda once more had known better, he would have done better. But what Kenneth Kaunda deserves today as we put him to rest is not only an applause, as we should have continued applauding him for bringing us peace, but also we must take his teaching seriously of one Zambia, one nation. Today's paper is titled KK's Dream Will Live On. And today is the July the 3rd. Truly, just about to be buried on the July the 7th. Truly, his dream must live on. The leaders that are to take charge, either if we're going to continue or going to change the wheels of the bus, we should take Zambia seriously, and the character should be one of courage, to learn from countries and how they handle themselves, and to continue one Zambia, one nation. I'm glad with the report.
For the power of truth, this is the Glad Report.